I have presided over this courtroom long enough to know that thieves rarely wear ski masks anymore. Instead, they arrive wearing heavy work boots, carrying branded clipboards, and speaking in a rapid-fire barrage of industry jargon, supply chain delays, permit processing, material costs, as if confusing a victim is the same thing as fulfilling a contract. They use the illusion of professional expertise to wash the cruelty off a deliberate con. That was precisely the kind of arrogance that strode into my courtroom the morning Mark Vance stood before me. He was 45 years old, the owner of a local home remodeling business, and he wore the thoroughly annoyed expression of a man who believed his time was far too valuable to be wasted on answering to a judge. He stood with his shoulders squared in a pristine flannel shirt that had clearly never seen a day of actual drywall dust, one hand casually resting on a stack of heavily redacted invoices, the other tucked into his pocket, as if this entire legal proceeding was merely a minor administrative error. He exuded the dangerous, unearned confidence of a man who had talked his way out of trouble 100 times before and fully expected today to be number 101. Across the aisle from him sat Sarah Jenkins. She was 32 years old, a single mother of 2 young boys, wearing a sensible, slightly worn navy blouse. She carried the specific, heavy exhaustion of a woman who works 2 jobs just to keep her head above water, yet she possessed the kind of fierce, quiet stillness I recognize in mothers who have been pushed straight to the edge of ruin, but absolutely refuse to let their children see them fall. On paper, the docket described a painfully common scenario: a breach of contract, a dispute over an unfinished kitchen remodel, and a demand for a refunded deposit. It is the sort of civil case that looks like a routine misunderstanding over construction timelines until you peel back the sterile paperwork and see exactly who is holding the money and who has been left living in a demolished, unlivable house. Mr. Vance claimed that Sarah Jenkins had breached their agreement first, constantly changing her mind, delaying the project, and, most importantly, failing to pay the second installment of her deposit. To hear him tell it, he was the victim of a hysterical, indecisive client, and keeping her initial $10,000 deposit was simply his legal right to cover lost time and administrative friction. It was just business. Then, I turned my attention to the plaintiff and asked Miss Jenkins to tell me her side of the story. When Sarah Jenkins began to speak, her voice possessed a slight tremble. It was not born from a fear of the courtroom, but from the deeply suppressed rage of a woman who had been systematically ignored, condescended to, and dismissed. She explained to the court that it had taken her 4 agonizing years of scraping together every spare dollar from waitressing tips and picking up double shifts to save that $10,000 deposit. That money was not a casual luxury. It was a profound sacrifice. The kitchen in her modest duplex wasn't merely a space for cooking. It was the very heart of her household, the warm center where her boys did their homework and where she stretched cheap ingredients to make ends meet. Mark Vance had looked her in the eye and promised a safe, functional remodel within 3 weeks. Instead, she testified, his demolition crew arrived on a Tuesday, enthusiastically gutted the kitchen down to the bare wooden studs, ripped out the functioning plumbing, left a pile of hazardous debris with exposed nails on the linoleum, and then simply vanished into thin air. For 2 excruciating months, Sarah and her young children had been forced to live inside a hazardous construction zone. They were washing their cereal bowls in the bathroom bathtub and surviving off a single microwave plugged into a precarious extension cord in the living room. I slowly reviewed the evidentiary photographs she submitted to the bench. They were not just standard images of missing drywall and exposed pipes. They were vivid portraits of domestic chaos, deliberately imposed by a reckless, indifferent opportunist. I called his office every single day, she stated, her posture straightening as she finally turned her gaze directly toward the contractor. I begged him to just come back and hook up the sink so I could feed my kids. He told me the cabinets were delayed by the supplier. Then he claimed his entire crew was out sick. Then, he just stopped answering my calls altogether. As she spoke, Mark Vance did not look at her. Men like him rarely do when the human cost of their greed is laid bare in a public forum. He simply sighed, shifting his weight and rolling his eyes dramatically for my benefit, as if he were the true victim, suffering through a tedious inconvenience. According to Sarah, when she finally sent him a desperate email threatening to hire someone else just to make her home safe again, Vance suddenly reappeared. But he didn't arrive with a tool belt or an apology. He arrived with a hostile, formal demand for the second installment of $5,000, claiming it was suddenly required to expedite the missing materials. When Sarah wisely refused to hand over another dime for a job completely abandoned, he slapped her with a breach of contract notice and threatened to put a legal lien on her house. It is a terrifying thing to realize that the person holding the keys to your home, the person who has taken a substantial portion of your life savings, has absolutely no intention of finishing the job. Sarah Jenkins sat in her living room amidst piles of splintered wood and exposed wire, holding a legal threat from a man who had already stolen $10,000 from her, and she realized he was banking entirely on her exhaustion. Mark Vance assumed that a single mother working 2 jobs simply would not have the time, the financial resources, or the emotional bandwidth to fight him in court. He assumed she would capitulate, pay the extortion fee, or simply walk away and accept the catastrophic loss. He assumed she was an easy target. He was wrong. When Sarah finished recounting her grueling ordeal, the courtroom was deathly silent. The kind of silence that doesn't just mean people aren't speaking. It means people are genuinely listening, waiting for the inevitable clash of truth against fiction. I turned my attention back to the defendant. "Mr. Vance," I began, keeping my voice dangerously level, the way I do when I am giving a liar just enough rope to hang himself. "You are claiming that Miss Jenkins breached the contract by refusing to pay the second installment, and therefore, you are legally entitled to retain her $10,000 deposit for administrative friction. Is that your official position?" He smirked, a quick, dismissive twitch of his lips that signaled his unwavering belief in his own superiority. "Yes, Your Honor. The contract clearly stipulates that materials must be paid for in advance of the second phase. She refused to pay." I couldn't move forward. My hands were tied. He gestured toward his folder of papers, as if the physical weight of his documents could somehow legitimize his extortion. "It's all in the contract she signed. I'm just following the agreed-upon procedure." Procedure. I repeated the word slowly, letting it hang in the sterile air of the courtroom. It is a fascinating word. Opportunists absolutely love the word procedure. They use it as a shield, a polite bureaucratic wall to hide behind when their actions are morally indefensible. "So, you are testifying under oath that the sole reason the work stopped, the only reason you left a mother and her 2 children living in a hazardous demolition zone for 2 months was because she refused to pay the scheduled second installment for materials?" "Exactly," he replied smoothly, leaning forward slightly, confident that his narrative was impenetrable. She panicked. She changed her mind. She tried to back out, and I had already allocated the resources. "I have overhead, Your Honor." "I see," I said. "And did you communicate to Miss Jenkins that her cabinets were delayed by the supplier?" "I did," he answered without hesitation. "And did you also tell her that your entire crew was out sick?" "Yes. We had a flu bug go through the team. It happens in this industry. Unavoidable delays." He spread his hands, the very picture of reasonable inconvenience. I leaned back in my chair and looked at him. "Mr. Vance, do you have any documentation, an email, a text message, a formal letter from the supplier confirming this alleged delay in materials? Do you have any records indicating that your crew was incapacitated during those specific weeks?" For the first time, a microscopic crack appeared in his polished veneer. He shifted his weight, his eyes darting toward his thick folder before returning to me. "I don't have those specific internal communications with me today, Your Honor, but it's standard industry practice. The burden is on her for refusing the second payment." "The burden is on her," Vance repeated, his voice hardening as he tapped a manicured finger against his leather-bound portfolio. Section 4, Paragraph 2. "Failure to remit scheduled progress payments constitutes a material breach, releasing the contractor from all timelines. I am a businessman, Your Honor. I cannot finance her kitchen out of my own pocket while she plays games and decides if she wants to pay." He looked around the courtroom, seeking the invisible audience of fellow professionals who would surely understand his plight. It is a common tactic among fraudsters who operate within the margins of civil law. They weaponize the fine print. They draft contracts so thick with legalese and hidden trapdoors that the actual service they promise to deliver becomes entirely secondary to the penalties they can aggressively enforce. "So, let me ensure I have this timeline perfectly accurate," I said, leaning over the bench and staring directly into his eyes. "You demolished her kitchen on a Tuesday. By Thursday, you claimed sudden supply chain issues. A week later, a mysterious phantom flu wiped out your entire workforce. For 2 solid months, you ignored a mother's desperate phone calls. Then, miraculously, You reappear not with the cabinets you promised, but with a demand for an additional $5,000 to expedite the very materials you were already contracted to provide. And when she refused to be extorted, you cited Section 4, Paragraph 2. It's not extortion, it's business, Vance snapped, his professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the predatory sneer beneath. She was a difficult client, constantly nagging. I have high-end clients in gated communities who don't harass my office the way she did over a basic, low-budget remodel. Frankly, I was glad to terminate the relationship. Difficult, Sarah whispered. The word seemed to get caught in her throat before she swallowed it down, physically bracing herself against the defendant's table. I wasn't nagging you, Mark. I was asking you to put my kitchen sink back so my children could have clean water. She reached into her worn purse and pulled out a single, neatly folded sheet of printed paper. It wasn't a bound legal portfolio. It wasn't a heavily redacted contract. He didn't stop the work because of a flu bug, Your Honor, Sarah said, her voice steadying into something incredibly cold and sharp, and he didn't stop because of a cabinet delay. He stopped because he got a better offer, and he thought he could keep my life savings to fund it. I asked the bailiff to bring the piece of paper to the bench. As it passed from Sarah's trembling hand to my desk, I watched Mark Vance. The unearned, untouchable energy he had carried into my courtroom was suddenly evaporating. He no longer looked like a master of industry. He looked like a man desperately trying to calculate his escape route. Miss Jenkins, I said, adjusting my glasses and looking at the printout, explain to the court exactly what I am looking at. She took a deep, steadying breath. That is a screenshot of a text message Mr. Vance sent to my phone on the morning of November 12th. He deleted it almost immediately using the unsend feature, but he didn't realize that my older phone model still captures the original text in the lock screen notification center. I took a screenshot of the notification before I opened the app. The message was not about a mysterious flu bug. It was not about supply chain disruptions, material shortages, or backordered cabinets. It was a message clearly intended for his project foreman, accidentally sent to the single mother whose home he had just ruthlessly demolished. I read the text aloud so the court reporter could capture every single damning syllable. It says, "Pull the boys off the Jenkins kitchen today. The Oakwood Estates job just approved our premium bid. Let her sit on the demo for a month until she coughs up the second phase payment or quits. We need all manpower on the big fish." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a complete privilege collapse. You could practically hear the arrogant foundation of Mark Vance's entire defense cracking down the middle. This was the moment the mask came off. "A flu bug, Mr. Vance?" I asked, lowering the paper and fixing my gaze entirely on him. "Supply chain issues? Or was it simply that a wealthy client in a gated community waved a bigger check in your face, and you decided that a working-class mother of two was a small enough fish to drown in the process?" His crisp flannel shirt suddenly looked a little too tight around the collar. He opened his mouth, but the polished bureaucratic jargon had completely evaporated. "Your Honor, that message is taken entirely out of context. It was a joke, a sarcastic misunderstanding with my foreman." "A joke," I repeated, letting the sheer absurdity of the lie hang in the sterile courtroom air. "I assure you, Mr. Vance, leaving 2 children to eat out of a bathroom sink so you can chase a premium bid is many things, but a joke is not one of them." "A joke is supposed to be funny, Mr. Vance," I said, my voice dropping to a register that leaves absolutely no room for debate. "There is nothing remotely amusing about a mother washing her children's dishes in a bathroom sink while you hold her life savings hostage. There is no punchline in deliberately leaving a home structurally hazardous to apply psychological pressure." I watched the remaining color drain completely from his face. The audacity to stand under oath in a court of law and attempt to rebrand calculated extortion as casual workplace banter is a very specific type of hubris. It is the hubris of a man who has lived his entire professional life entirely free of consequences. He genuinely believed that a slick, professionally printed contract and a loud, intimidating voice could steamroll any opposition, especially a single mother he had already profiled as weak. I directed my attention to the heavily tabbed leather portfolio he had been resting his hand on all morning, his so-called ironclad shield. "Let us talk about your sacred paperwork, since you are so profoundly fond of citing Section 4, Paragraph 2. A contract is a legally binding agreement predicated on mutual good faith. It is a promise of service, not a financial hunting license. It is not a weapon to be wielded the moment you decide a more lucrative opportunity has come along. When you deliberately pulled your crew off her property to chase a premium bid at Oakwood Estates, you committed a material breach. You abandoned the job, he stammered, his posture collapsing as he desperately attempted to retreat back into his administrative jargon. Your Honor, the allocation of daily labor is strictly at the contractor's discretion. The business has to— Do not speak to me about labor allocation. I cut him off sharply, the crack of my gavel echoing against the wood. You manufactured a crisis. You lied directly to your client about supply chain issues. You fabricated a phantom flu epidemic. You deliberately left this woman's home in a state of chaotic disrepair to apply maximum financial pressure, hoping she would blindly hand over a $5,000 ransom for materials you were already obligated to provide. The illusion of the respectable, highly sought-after businessman was completely shattered. What stood before me was no longer a master contractor. It was nothing more than a neighborhood bully who used invoices and legal terminology instead of his fists. I looked down at the printed screenshot again, my eyes locking onto one specific phrase: "Let her sit on the demo for a month until she coughs up the second phase payment or quits." That sentence right there, I said, pointing directly at him. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a predatory business model. You deliberately target people you assume do not have the financial resources or the emotional stamina to fight back. You banked on her exhaustion. I had to keep my options open, Your Honor, Mark Vance finally stammered, his voice lacking any of its former resonance. In the contracting business, margins are tight. You have to prioritize the clients who can pay the premium rates. And you decided Miss Jenkins was no longer a priority the moment a bigger check cleared your desk, I stated, the finality in my voice matching the absolute collapse of his defense. You did not keep your options open, Mr. Vance. You committed fraud. You entered into a legally binding agreement to perform a service, accepted a $10,000 deposit, demolished a functional living space, and then deliberately abandoned the job under false pretenses to pursue a more lucrative contract. Then, to add insult to injury, you attempted to extort an additional $5,000 from a single mother by holding her demolished kitchen hostage, citing administrative friction. I looked at Sarah Jenkins. She was no longer trembling. The crushing weight of the last 2 months, the exhaustion, the fear, the gaslighting seemed to lift from her shoulders the moment the truth was finally spoken aloud and validated in a court of law. Miss Jenkins, I said, my tone softening just a fraction, did you hire another contractor to make your home livable again? Yes, Your Honor, she replied clearly. I had to take out a high-interest personal loan to cover it, but a new crew came in last week. They managed to get the sink hooked up and the walls closed in so my boys wouldn't get hurt. And what was the total cost of that emergency remediation? $12,000, Your Honor. I turned my gaze back to Mark Vance. The man who had walked in expecting to steamroll his way to a victory was now staring down at his expensive leather shoes. Mr. Vance, your conduct in this matter goes far beyond a simple breach of contract. It is deceptive, predatory, and entirely in bad faith. You used your position and your industry knowledge to deliberately exploit a vulnerable client for personal profit. You weaponized her living conditions to try and force a payment you were not entitled to. I picked up my pen. I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff, Sarah Jenkins. Mr. Vance, you are ordered to immediately refund her entire $10,000 initial deposit. Furthermore, because your deliberate abandonment of the project forced her to incur emergency remediation costs, you are ordered to pay an additional $2,000 to cover those specific damages, bringing the total judgment to the maximum allowable limit in this court of $12,000. When the gavel fell, Mark Vance did not explode into a theatrical rage. Instead, he visibly deflated. The corporate bluster, the relentless industry jargon, the imposing physical stance, it all completely vanished the very second the financial penalty became an undeniable reality. He muttered something under his breath about appealing the court's decision, but the noticeable tremor in his voice betrayed him. He knew he was utterly beaten. Before you leave my courtroom, Mr. Vance, I added, ensuring my voice carried all the way to the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room, you should know that this financial judgment will be accompanied by a formal transcript of today's proceedings, which I am forwarding directly to the State Contractors Licensing Board and the Better Business Bureau. I highly doubt they will find your administrative friction defense quite as amusing as you initially did. His attorney finally stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Vance's arm to quickly usher him out of the room, before he could do any more catastrophic damage to his own livelihood. They left the courtroom much faster than they had entered it. Sarah Jenkins remained at the plaintiff's table for a moment longer. She didn't cheer, and she didn't gloat. The profound relief of a single mother who had just fought an arrogant titan of industry and won doesn't usually manifest as a loud celebration. It manifests as a quiet, heavy exhale. She carefully folded the printed screenshot of that deleted text message, placed it securely back into her worn purse, and stood up with her dignity completely restored. She had walked into my courtroom carrying the crushing weight of a predator's manipulation, and she walked out visibly lighter, having definitively proven that her truth was far stronger than his weaponized paperwork. I have sat on this bench for decades, and cases exactly like this remind me why the law must exist in the first place. The legal system is not meant to be a playground for well-dressed opportunists who believe they can use contracts to indiscriminately crush the vulnerable. A corporate logo, a pristine flannel shirt, and a confident vocabulary do not grant anyone immunity from basic human decency. Mark Vance genuinely thought he was entirely untouchable simply because he had money, leverage, and a team of lawyers. He believed his deleted text would simply disappear into the digital ether, taking his cruelty with it. But character is exactly what remains when the mask of power inevitably slips. That single, carelessly sent message did not bankrupt Mark Vance by magic. His own unchecked greed did that. The text merely reminded the room who he actually was beneath the polished exterior. And once that mask comes off, justice follows naturally.